Welcome to Roll Credits, where movie lovers get the trivia they didn't know they needed. This deep dive was created with help from AI tools, so double-check any quotes before you drop trivia at your next movie night.
Yeah, that is always a solid rule of thumb.
Right. Today we're stepping into The Karate Kid. And, did you know Pat Morita was nominated for an Oscar for playing Mr. Miyagi, even though he was mostly known for comedy before this role?
Which is still, honestly, one of the wildest casting pivots in Hollywood history.
It really is. And before we get into it, drop a comment and let us know what movie or show we should cover next, old or new.
So to really get into this, I want you to picture something first, because it sets the stage for everything we're going to unpack today.
Okay, lay on me.
It's the sweltering summer of 1984. You've just walked out of a crowded, air-conditioned movie theater on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, right? Stepping out into that thick, humid New York evening air.
Oh, yeah. I know that feeling.
Exactly. The streetlights are humming, yellow cabs are honking, and all around you, the strangest phenomenon is taking place. People like little kids in shorts, teenagers with denim jackets, even grown adults in suits who just got off work are suddenly stopping right there on the concrete sidewalk.
Wait, like a flash mob?
No, completely uncoordinated. They're all just lifting one leg up, tucking their knee into their chest. They're raising their arms into the air, hands dangling loosely from the wrists like wings.
Oh my God, the crane kick.
Yes. They are all simultaneously trying to find their center of gravity, balancing on one foot, attempting to execute a perfect crane kick. It was a real-time cultural shockwave.
That is just, when you look back at the history of cinema, that kind of visceral, immediate physical reaction from a crowd is incredibly rare.
It's almost unheard of. Today, we're so used to seeing iconic movie moments instantly packaged into, internet memes or TikTok dances, right? Completely divorced from their original emotional context.
Yeah, they just become algorithms.
Exactly. But what happened in 1984 wasn't driven by an algorithm. That was the moment a piece of pop culture just transcended the screen. It bypassed the analytical part of the brain and literally moved into the muscle memory of the people watching it.
Because the story had so completely captivated them, they just felt compelled to physically embody it the second they hit the street.
Right. And our mission today for this deep dive is to figure out exactly how a relatively straightforward, low-budget sports drama about a bullied kid managed to evolve into this enduring cultural juggernaut.
Because we've got a massive stack of sources today. Comprehensive retrospective interviews, oral histories from the cast, deeply researched historical analyses into the actors' real lives.
And some modern reflections on how the sequels and that 2010 remake shaped the legacy.
Right. And as I've been going through these notes, it is just stunning to realize how much pain is hiding beneath the surface of this ultimate feel-good underdog story.
It really is. To understand the phenomenon, we have to look past the iconic catchphrases. We need to look at the socioeconomic anxieties of the 1980s, the history of Japanese-American relations, and, of course, the fundamental mechanics of martial arts philosophy.
Okay, so let's start with the blueprint. The premise of the original 1984 film is pretty much etched into our collective consciousness at this point.
Right. It's the ultimate blend of the sports drama and the coming-of-age story.
Yeah, we follow Daniel LaRusso, this skinny, fast-talking, entirely displaced outsider from Newark, New Jersey. His single mom gets a job across the country, so they move to Southern California, specifically the lower-income area of Reseda in the San Fernando Valley.
And the culture shock hits him instantly.
Instantly. He doesn't have the blonde hair, he doesn't have the money, he doesn't have the dirt bike. He just magnetically becomes the prime target for a group of ruthless, affluent bullies from the local Cobra Kai dojo.
Led by the terrifying Johnny Lawrence.
Exactly. And Daniel is beaten down and completely lost until he finds guidance from the most unlikely source, Mr. Miyagi, this unassuming repairman at his apartment complex who secretly happens to be an Okinawan martial arts master.
And crucially, Miyagi doesn't just teach Daniel how to throw a punch. He teaches him how to find inner balance, which is the actual thematic core of the narrative.
Right, culminating in that big showdown at the Under-18 All-Valley Karate Tournament.
Yeah.
Now, on paper, if you just read that synopsis, it sounds like a very standard Hollywood formula.
It does. But we have to look at where that formula came from, because the origins of this script are intensely personal to the film's creator and screenwriter, Robert Mark Kamen.
See, I always kind of assumed this was just a pitch concocted in a studio boardroom to capitalize on the martial arts craze of the 70s and 80s. But Kamen actually lived a really terrifying version of this, didn't he?
He did. We have to go all the way back to 1964. Kamen was a 17-year-old kid, and he was walking home from the New York World's Fair when he was ambushed and severely beaten up by a gang of bullies.
Wow, just a random ambush.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a minor scuffle. It was a traumatic event that instilled this profound sense of physical vulnerability in him, that humiliation, that realization that you can't protect yourself from the violence of the world.
Yeah,
It drove him to aggressively seek out self-defense.
which makes total sense.
Right. So he began studying a very specific traditional form of martial arts called Okinawan Gujuru Karate.
Let's actually pause there and explain the technical side of this. Because
Okay.
I think a lot of people, myself included, before looking at these sources, just use the word karate as a blanket term for any kind of kicking and punching.
Oh, absolutely. It gets used as a catch-all.
Right. But gujuri is a very distinct style, isn't it?
Yeah.
What makes it different from, like, the flashy strip mall karate we usually picture?
That's a critical distinction. The word gujuri translates literally to hard, soft style. Go means hard, and ju means soft.
Hard and sauce, okay.
Yeah, it's a traditional Okinawan style that emphasizes a combination of hard, closed-fist linear attacks combined with soft, open-handed circular blocking techniques.
Okay, so unlike those highly stylized acrobatic martial arts that look great from 50 feet away, this is different.
Exactly. Gujuri was designed for close-quarters combat. It relies heavily on intercepting an opponent's momentum rather than meeting force with force. And, maybe most importantly, it heavily emphasizes deep, cyclical breathing techniques to center the body and mind.
Which entirely explains Mr. Miyagi's constant instruction to Daniel, breathe in through the nose, out the mouth. It's not just a relaxation technique.
No, it's the fundamental biomechanical engine of the martial art Kamen was learning.
That is so cool.
And here is where the history becomes directly woven into the script. Kamen's actual sensei had been taught directly by a man named Chujun Miyagi.
Wait, Chujun Miyagi.
Yes, Chujun Miyagi is the real historical founder of the Okinawan Gujuri style.
That blows my mind. So the name Mr. Miyagi isn't just a quirky character name pulled out of a hat. It's a literal, direct homage to the founder of the art that saved the screenwriter from his own teenage trauma.
Precisely. Now, fast forward a couple of decades to the early 1980s. Kamen has become a writer, and his mentor is Frank Price, who was the chair of Columbia Pictures at the time.
Huh?
Price had recently optioned a short, local newspaper article about a 9-year-old boy in Hawaii who had earned a black belt specifically to defend himself against neighborhood bullies.
So that was the original seed for the studio.
Right. Price brings this clipping to Kamen, knowing he has a martial arts background, and asks if he could adapt it into a screenplay.
And what did Kamen say?
Kamen looks at it and essentially tells the head of the studio that the newspaper story is thin and unworkable, but he has a much, much better story to tell, his own.
Wow. But even then, he didn't just write a straight autobiography, right? He wanted to distill his experience into an archetype.
Right. He didn't want to write a documentary about himself, and he didn't want a standard action flick where the hero just beats up the bad guys and walks away. He wanted to capture the emotional essence of what finding karate actually felt like to a terrified teenager.
Which is a very vulnerable place to write from.
It is. More importantly, he wanted to explore the archetype of the perfect teacher. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the film isn't really about fighting. It taps into a primal, universal human desire for a protector.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, we all, regardless of our age, want a mentor who is completely non-judgmental, who offers unconditional love, but who also possesses the fierce, terrifying capability to defend us from the wolves at the door.
Okay, let's unpack this. I completely agree with the emotional resonance of that.
Yeah.
But I have to push back a little on the originality aspect.
Yeah.
When I watch the fundamental structure of the movie, isn't this really just Rocky retrofitted for teenagers?
It's a fair point to raise.
I mean, the director, John G. Avildsen, literally won an Academy Award for directing Rocky in 1976. You have the down-on-his-luck underdog, the unorthodox training montages set to swelling music, the big tournament at the end against a superior opponent. Our sources even note that Sylvester Stallone reportedly swore for years that Kamen had basically ripped him off.
It is a very fair comparison on the surface, and having Avildsen behind the camera certainly invites that parallel. Avildsen had a very specific, gritty, documentary-like style that grounded underdog stories in mundane working-class reality.
Right, you can feel the grime in both movies.
Exactly. But if you look at the fundamental narrative engines of the two scripts, they're actually driving in opposite directions.
How do you mean?
Well, Rocky is fundamentally a story about self-worth. Rocky Balboa is a man trying to prove to himself, to Adrian, and to the entire city of Philadelphia that he isn't a bum. His goal is to go the distance just to validate his own existence.
Right, he just wants to stand at the end.
Exactly. The Karate Kid, conversely, is a story about finding balance in a chaotic, hostile environment. Daniel LaRusso already has a decent sense of self-worth. He's cocky, he talks back, he thinks he's a tough guy from Newark.
That's true. He never thinks he's worthless.
Right. He isn't trying to prove his worth to the world. He is trying to physically survive the brutal social hierarchy of high school, find a surrogate father figure, and learn how to navigate aggression without losing his own humanity.
That is a phenomenal distinction. Rocky needs to learn how to fight to prove he matters. Daniel needs to learn how to fight so he doesn't have to fight anymore.
Exactly.
But having a great personal script is one thing. Finding an actor who can actually physically embody that specific brand of East Coast, chip-on-the-shoulder desperation without making the audience absolutely hate him is another challenge entirely.
It's a massive tightrope walk.
Because if Daniel is too whiny, the movie collapses. If he's too tough, the bullying doesn't feel threatening.
Which brings us to the monumental task of casting. Let's look closely at Ralph Macchio. Most people assume he was an actual teenager when they shot the film, but Macchio is actually 22 years old during production.
Wait, 22? He looks like he's 15?
I know. He possessed this incredibly youthful, almost delicate physical appearance. In fact, he looked so young that the rest of the cast and crew routinely didn't believe him when he stated his actual age.
He also brought a very specific energy to the room. He had just come off Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders, playing Johnny Cade alongside this powerhouse cast of young actors like Tom Cruise, Patrick Swayze, Matt Dillon.
Yeah, that was a huge deal for him.
The reviews for his performance were stellar. And by his own admission in his later memoirs, he was feeling pretty good about himself. He had a bit of a swollen ego.
Oh, for sure.
So when his agent calls him to audition for a movie called The Karate Kid, his immediate reaction is extreme skepticism. He literally mocked it, asking his agent, "That's a silly title. Is it a Saturday morning cartoon?"
And that reaction perfectly encapsulates the exact bravado of Daniel LaRusso. When Macchio finally went to John G. Avildsen's apartment in New York for the audition, he walked into a hallway packed with other young, handsome actors vying for the role.
And what were they doing?
They were all sitting around making fun of the title. Macchio later recalled that in that moment, a switch flipped in his brain. He instantly became intensely defensive of the project, almost entirely out of contrarian spite.
I love that. He's like, only I can make fun of this.
Exactly. He walked into the room, sat down in front of Avildsen's bulky video camera, and purposefully leaned extremely heavy into his nasal, fast-talking Long Island accent.
He essentially weaponized his East Coast attitude.
Ah!
He used it to highlight exactly what Daniel was experiencing in the script. This hyper-defensive, prickly, out-of-place posture in a California Valley town where everyone else seems to be glowing with blonde hair, perfect tans, and BMWs.
He wanted to visually and aurally defend his roots.
Although Macchio did admit there was one massive glaring difference between his real personality and Daniel's.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He pointed out that Daniel possessed this relentless, almost foolish bravado, where he just continually refused to quit, no matter how badly he was beaten. Macchio joked that if he personally got his ass kicked by 5 highly trained karate experts on motorcycles on a Friday night, he probably would have just found a completely different route to school on Monday morning.
I mean, that's just common sense. But it's precisely that stubborn, almost irrational refusal to stay down on the mat that defines Daniel as a hero.
Absolutely.
But a hero's resilience is only as compelling as the force trying to break him. To make Daniel's journey work, the film needed the ultimate antagonist.
Enter William Zabka, cast as Johnny Lawrence, the terrifying alpha male leader of the Cobra Kai bullies.
And what's absolutely fascinating here is that despite how intimidating and physically graceful he looks on screen, Zabka had zero karate experience prior to being cast in this film.
Nothing. Not a single class. He was, however, an accomplished high school wrestler.
Right. And that background gave him incredible physical flexibility, spatial awareness, and athletic conditioning, which meant he could learn choreography quickly, but he was entirely faking the actual martial arts aesthetic at first.
But what won him the role wasn't his roundhouse kick. It was his audition. And the story of his audition is legendary. Can you imagine walking into an audition and physically grabbing the Oscar-winning director of Rocky?
It's insane. So Zabka was called into the Columbia Pictures lot for his read. He arrived straight from working out at the gym, wearing a tight tank top and a headband.
Looking exactly like an 80s movie boy.
Exactly. He read the sides and initially thought, I don't ride dirt bikes, I'm not in a gang, and I don't know karate, this isn't me. But he managed to connect emotionally to a specific scene, a scene that was actually cut from the final film, by the way.
Oh, which scene?
It's where Johnny corners Daniel at a school water fountain and hands him a blank death certificate, telling him to get his mommy to sign it before the upcoming tournament.
Oof, that is dark.
Very. And during the audition, Zabka is reading opposite Avildsen. In the scene, Daniel quietly asks Johnny if his karate instructor might be wrong about his brutal philosophy. Johnny's scripted response is a venomous, watch your mouth, asshole.
And Zabka didn't just read it?
Slow-mo, he drops the script, physically walks across the room, grabs Janji Avildsen by the front of his shirt, shoves him backward, and snarls the line right into the director's face.
Oh my God. The entire room must have gone dead silent.
The producers were in shock. Zabka stays in character, improvises a threatening exit line, and storms out into the waiting room.
And then the adrenaline wears off.
Exactly. The moment the door closes behind him, he realizes he just assaulted an Academy Award-winning director. He panics, rips off his headband, timidly opens the door, walks back in and stammers, I'm so sorry, that was Johnny. I'm actually Billy, I'm a nice guy.
But Avildsen was hooked. He saw the exact explosive volatility he needed.
He really did. Though Avildsen, testing the kid, noted out loud that Zabka was a couple of inches taller and noticeably bulkier than their chosen karate kid, Ralph Macchio, wondering if the physical mismatch was too much.
And Zabka, without missing a beat, fired back. Well, Bruce Lee was smaller than Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he kicked his ass in Game of Death.
Yes, and Avildsen just laughed and said, well, you got a point there. Thanks, kid. That is the masterclass in how you aggressively seize a role.
Honestly, it's brilliant. Then, completing the central teenage triad, you have Elizabeth Shue playing Ollie Mills. Ollie serves as the athletic, natural catalyst for the rivalry between Daniel and Johnny.
And Avildsen had a brilliant, highly evocative way of describing the aesthetic pairing of Daniel and Ollie. He called them a strawberry shortcake and a cannoli.
That is the perfect metaphor. The polished, sweet, affluent country club girl and the rough, gritty, slightly cynical kid from the East Coast bakeries. They just fundamentally shouldn't belong together socially, which is exactly what makes their dynamic so compelling.
And Shue brought a real physical toughness to the role, too. She was a highly competitive soccer player in real life, not a fragile ingenue.
Right. There is a famous scene at the country club where a waiter bumps into Daniel, spilling a plate of spaghetti all over his white outfit. Johnny starts laughing hysterically. Ollie, furious, walks up and swings a right hook, punching Johnny in the face.
And when they were filming that, Elizabeth Shue absolutely refused to fake the swing.
Patty Johnson, the film's legendary fight coordinator, kept pulling her aside, instructing her to step back, establish a safe distance, and just fake the swing for the camera angle. But Shue wanted it to look real.
So in take after take, she just kept actually clocking William Zabka right in the jaw?
Zabka later admitted that if you look closely at the final cut, he is half laughing in the scene, not just because of the character's arrogance, but from the sheer bewildering shock of being continually punched in the face by Elizabeth Shue.
That underlying physical reality brings us to how the tension on the set was so carefully and deliberately managed by the crew. You mentioned Patty Johnson.
Yeah, who actually plays the stern head referee in the final tournament on screen.
Right. Johnson had a monumental task. He had to train Macchio and Pat Morita in the classical, defensive, circular Okinawan Gujuri style. But simultaneously, he had to train Zabka and the entire Cobra Kai cast in a harsh, aggressive, linear style, which was heavily based on the Korean martial art of Tang Soo Do.
It's like he was running a psychological Stanford prison experiment right there on the Hollywood backlot.
Yeah.
He didn't just teach these actors how to fake fight. He actively programmed their social dynamics off camera so that the animosity would naturally bleed onto the screen.
Exactly. Avildsen and Johnson completely separated the two groups during the entire rehearsal and production process. They wanted to breed a genuine pack mentality among the Cobra Kai actors.
So Macchio and Zabka couldn't even hang out.
No. They were friendly in passing, but they were strictly forbidden from eating lunch together or socializing between takes.
The psychological manipulation worked flawlessly. It made the rivalry feel incredibly authentic. And the irony of this intense method acting environment is just beautiful when you look at the reality of who these kids were.
Oh, you're talking about the tournament scene?
Yes. This is my favorite piece of trivia. During the grueling filming of the final tournament sequence, they had hundreds of extras in the crowd. The atmosphere was so electric, and the Cobra Kai actors had played their villainous roles so convincingly that the extras got genuinely worked up.
They really turned on them.
They started fiercely booing William Zabka and the Cobra Kai team, even when the director yelled, "Cut!" and the camera stopped rolling. The hostility in the room was palpable, and sitting right there in the middle of those bleachers was William Zabka's real-life mother.
Oh, no.
Yes. She spent hours frantically turning to the angry, booing strangers around her, pleading with them, "It's okay, please stop, that's my baby down there. He's actually a really sweet boy in real life."
It is a wonderful testament to the casting and the immersive environment Avildsen created.
It really is. But, while the kids brought the teenage angst and physicality, the entire film hinged on a casting choice that the studio vehemently opposed.
And that, of course, is the casting of Pat Morita as Mr. Miyagi. This is where the story shifts from a fun, nostalgic Hollywood behind-the-scenes anecdote into something incredibly deep, historically significant, and profoundly moving.
Definitely. To set the scene, the studio executives at Columbia Pictures knew that the role of Mr. Miyagi was the philosophical anchor of the film.
Right. They wanted a serious, highly established, dramatic actor for the role. They were actively floating names like Toshiro Mifune, the legendary, fiercely intimidating Japanese actor who starred in Akira Kurosawa epics like Seven Samurai.
The glaring problem there being that Mifune didn't speak a word of English, making the nuanced, dialogue-heavy mentorship scenes impossible.
Exactly. Despite this, the film's powerhouse producer, Jerry Weintraub, flat out rejected Pat Morita's name when it was suggested.
He explicitly stated that he absolutely did not want a sitcom comic in his serious film. At the time, Morita was best known to American audiences for playing the goofy, laugh-track-generating character Arnold on the hit sitcom Happy Days.
Right. Jerry Weintraub literally said no. Morita had spent years playing broad caricatures for cheap laughs. He was a stand-up comedian.
But Avildsen, with his eye for hidden grit, saw something completely different in Morita.
He did. On January 15, 1983, during a tense business meeting regarding casting, Avildsen secretly queued up a dramatic audition tape that he had shot with Morita. He waited for the right moment and then played it right in the middle of the room, essentially ambushing the producer.
And Weintraub froze. Because on that fuzzy videotape, Morita he wasn't cracking jokes. He was projecting this quiet, immense, wounded soul.
But even after seeing the tape, the studio's bias against a comedy actor didn't vanish instantly. They forced Morita to endure a grueling process of 5 separate chemistry reads with Ralph Macchio over the course of 3 months.
5 reads. That's intense.
Yeah, each session lasted about 45 minutes in a sterile, bare-bones Los Angeles rehearsal studio. And every single time, Morita had to walk into that room and summon the exact same profound calm, the exact same hidden pain.
Macchio later described their very first read together as feeling completely effortless, stating it felt as if they had been, in his words, kissed by some soulful magic.
It's like casting a slapstick comedian to play a Shakespearean tragic hero and discovering they've lived a real-life tragedy the whole time.
Exactly. Because Pat Morita's personal history is absolutely staggering. If you really want to understand why this movie works, you have to understand Morita's childhood.
I agree. What's fascinating here is how Morita could inhabit Miyagi's specific brand of stoic pain so authentically. He was born Noriyuki Morita in 1932 to Japanese immigrant fruit pickers in Northern California. They lived in abject poverty in dirt floor migrant cabins.
And then, when he was just 2 years old, he contracted a severe case of spinal tuberculosis.
Right. For the next 9 years of his life, from 1934 to 1943, he was completely immobilized.
9 years.
He was placed in a full, rigid body cast at a Schreiner's hospital in San Francisco. Think about the psychological impact of that. He spent his entire early childhood unable to move his limbs, staring at a ceiling, listening to the radio, and watching other sick children in the ward slowly disappear as the disease inevitably took them.
It is heartbreaking. He developed his comedic timing in that sterile hospital ward simply as a desperate survival mechanism. He started making jokes, doing voices, and using little sock puppets just to make the exhausted nurses and the terrified dying kids around him laugh.
It was his only way to exert control over a helpless situation.
Miraculously, he survived the disease. At age 11, he underwent a massive, highly experimental spinal fusion surgery. He had to completely relearn how to balance his body and how to walk again. He finally took his first unaided steps in the summer of 1943.
And this is the twist in his life story that is just gut-wrenching. You have to picture this. He finally regains his bodily autonomy. He walks out of that hospital isolation ward, feeling the sunshine, ready to join the world.
And on November 1st, 1943, an FBI agent meets this frail, recovering 11-year-old boy, puts him in a car, and escorts him directly to the Gila River War Relocation Center in the Arizona desert.
An internment camp.
Yes, because of Executive Order 9066, enacted following the attack on Pearl Harbor, his entire family, along with over 100,000 other Japanese Americans, had been deemed a threat and imprisoned behind barbed wire.
The psychological whiplash is almost unimaginable. He traded a medical isolation ward for a government prison camp in a desolate wasteland.
Morita later recounted that he cried for days when he arrived at the camp. But he wasn't crying for his lost home. He had never really known a normal home. He was crying because he missed the doctors and the nurses at the hospital, who had been his only family for a decade.
His family was later transferred to the even stricter Tule Lake camp in Northern California, which was reserved for those the government deemed disloyal. He spent almost half his life institutionalized by the time he was 13 years old.
First stripped of his physical freedom by disease, and then stripped of his civil freedom by his own country.
And as he grew into an adult and entered the entertainment industry, he faced the brutal, unapologetic racism of the 1960s and 70s comedy club scene. He performed under the deeply offensive stage name, the Hip Nip.
He actively used a racial slur against himself to try and take back power in hostile, mostly white rooms. He fought for every single inch of screen time he got in Hollywood, often being relegated to nameless, stereotypical background roles.
This brings us to why his performance is so transcendent. What is vital to understand here is how all of that compounding trauma, that deeply ingrained need to hide agonizing pain behind a pleasant, humorous facade, it all translated directly into the character of Mr. Miyagi.
When Miyagi smiles in the film, it is not a joyful smile. It is a tight, measured smile that feels like a dam holding back an absolute ocean of grief.
Morita wasn't just acting out Kamen's script. He was carrying the heavy, unspoken historical weight of the Japanese-American internment experience on his shoulders.
Which, incredibly, the filmmakers explicitly wove into the lore of the movie. There is a pivotal scene where we learn that Miyagi's wife and newborn child died from complications during childbirth in Manzanar internment camp in September 1945, while Miyagi himself was overseas fighting for the U.S. Army.
The Karate Kid, a summer popcorn movie aimed at teenagers, was literally the first mainstream major motion picture to ever openly address the atrocities of the WWII Japanese internment camps.
It was groundbreaking. And yet the studio was so incredibly nervous about Morita's sitcom comedy background that they actively tried to hide his past during the film's promotional press tour.
They didn't want audiences to see him and be reminded of his cheap punchlines on Happy Days.
Furthermore, despite his undeniable talent, Morita had to fight tooth and nail just to be paid a fair wage. He begged the studio for $500,000 for the role, knowing how crucial it was, but the studio lowballed him and only gave him $150,000.
It is infuriating when you realize how much he brought to the table. The producers were so disconnected from the emotional core of the film that they actually wanted to cut the famous drunk Miyagi scene.
Oh, that devastating scene where Daniel walks into Miyagi's house and finds his mentor intoxicated, weeping over the faded telegram that announced the death of his wife and child.
The studio executives watched that in the editing room and complained that it slowed the pace of the movie down. Can you believe the absolute blindness of that note?
It's a classic example of studio executives prioritizing runtime over emotional resonance. Director John G. Avildsen fought aggressively, risking his own standing to keep that scene intact.
And cinematic history proved him entirely right. That display of raw, unfiltered historical grief is widely considered the primary reason Pat Morita received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor.
It is the absolute emotional anchor of the entire film. Without it, Miyagi is just a magical trope. With it, he is a deeply scarred human being. And honestly, Morita's physical limitations actually influenced the most famous training sequence in movie history.
Yes, let's transition into the choreography and the practical magic of the film. Robert Mark Kamen wanted to accurately cinematize the classical Okinawan gojuri blocking systems we discussed earlier.
Right, but he needed a way to translate them visually for an audience who didn't understand martial arts.
So he creatively translated these ancient defensive movements into mundane household chores. He literally invented the phrases, wax on, wax off, paint the fence, and sand the floor, specifically for the script.
It is brilliant screenwriting because it hides the martial arts training in plain sight. It builds Daniel's muscle memory without him realizing it. But when it came time to film those tight close-ups of the hands waxing the cars or painting the wood, the producers stepped in again.
Right, they wanted to use a younger, stronger stunt double's hands for those close-ups, thinking it would look more dynamic.
And this is where Morita exercised his artistic authority. He flat out refused the hand double. He insisted to Avildsen that the audience needed to see the authentic, rough, calloused, and slightly trembling hands of an older man.
His body had been permanently weakened by his childhood illnesses and surgeries, and he knew that those slow, circular waxing motions had to look authentic to the physical reality of a man of Miyagi's age.
For the actual fast-paced fighting, however, when Miyagi has to take down 5 teenagers on Halloween night, they did bring in a legend. Karate master Fumio Demura served as Morita's stunt double for the heavy combat scenes.
And Demura spent a massive amount of time on set with Morita. Morita, ever the observer, absorbed not just Demura's physical attitude towards combat, but his specific speech patterns, his cadence, and his subtle mannerisms, seamlessly folding them into Miyagi's character.
Contrast that slow, methodical training with the climax of the film. The All-Valley tournament was treated with the exact opposite energy.
It was highly choreographed, kinetic aggression. Ralph Macchio and William Zabka rehearsed their final tournament fight every single day for 3 solid months before the cameras rolled.
Macchio frequently compared the rehearsal process to learning a complex, high-stakes ballet.
Yeah.
Every foot placement, every parry had to be memorized to the inch.
And they filmed it in front of that massive crowd of riled-up extras we talked about. But to make the wide shots look incredibly authentic, the production actually hosted a real miniature karate tournament happening in the background.
They brought in real kids wearing pads from real local dojos and had them actively sparring on the adjacent mats. When you watch that 1984 tournament, you aren't just watching actors, you're watching real kids reacting to real aggression.
Which is why the electric energy of a genuine competition feels so thick in the room. And that brings us inevitably to the climax of the climax. We have to talk about the crane kick.
Wait, let's talk about the actual physics of the crane kick for a second, because this always bothers me when I watch MMA today. If you actually stand on one leg with your arms dangling loosely down by your waist, exposing your face and your ribs, isn't that a terrible, highly dangerous defensive posture?
You are entirely correct on the biomechanics. From a practical martial arts standpoint, the crane kick, as depicted in the film, leaves you completely vulnerable. Any trained fighter would just step in and sweep your base leg or punch you in the jaw.
Right, so why did this specific, highly impractical move resonate so massively with audiences?
You have to look at it through the lens of cinematic storytelling. The crane kick works precisely because it is impractical. It requires absolute, unwavering balance and complete internal focus, which represents the culmination of Daniel's entire emotional journey.
It's a move that requires you to be completely vulnerable and completely committed at the exact same moment.
Exactly. Macchio had very little martial arts experience prior to filming, just 4 generic jiu-jitsu lessons when he was a little kid, but he practiced that specific physical movement relentlessly until it looked like second nature.
And the emotional payoff was seismic. When Macchio watched the film for the first time at a sneak preview in Manhattan, he described the physical rush of seeing the audience react. During that final slow-motion jump, people literally leaped out of their theater seats, screaming.
It stands as the ultimate cinematic payoff. But what is equally interesting to film historians about the editing of The Karate Kid is what didn't make the final cut.
Oh, the missing scenes.
Yeah, Avildsen had to trim the film tightly for pacing. And in doing so, he removed several scenes that actually fill in some lingering narrative gaps.
Because sometimes you watch the movie today and think, wait, why is that character suddenly so aggressively mad? For instance, there is a legendary deleted cafeteria scene from Daniel's very first day of high school.
Right, where Daniel walks into the crowded cafeteria, sees Ollie, goes to sit down with her, and realizes too late that he has just sat right on top of a massive blueberry pie that Johnny deliberately placed on his chair.
Daniel is humiliated, gets absolutely furious, marches across the cafeteria, and slams the crushed pie right onto Johnny's pristine shirt.
Cutting that scene certainly saved runtime, but removing it means the rivalry in the school environment escalates from 0 to 100 very quickly, without seeing the daily tit-for-tat harassment.
There was also another cut scene showing Johnny physically threatening Daniel with a weapon in the school hallway.
And there is a really important one that explains a weird plot hole later. A scene where Daniel gets fiercely angry at Ollie because, from a distance, He sees her kissing Johnny at the country club.
He doesn't realize the kiss was forced. Without that scene, there's a moment later on when they're at the Golf and Stuff arcade, and Ollie is inexplicably cold and upset with Daniel, and Daniel is acting strangely aloof. The connective tissue explaining their fight was left entirely on the cutting room floor.
Though it clearly didn't hurt the film's success, it became a colossal, culture-defining hit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The music that defines that entire tournament montage, the driving synth-heavy song, You're the Best Around, performed by Joe Esposito. Today, that song is entirely synonymous with The Karate Kid. But it wasn't even written for this movie.
That's right. The vocal track You're the Best Around was actually a rejected song originally intended to be used in Rocky III. Sylvester Stallone passed on it in favor of Survivor's Eye of the Tiger.
Avildsen essentially grabbed a leftover Stallone track out of the studio trash can and turned it into the defining anthem of the 1980s.
It just goes to show how the creative DNA of those two underdog sports movies is completely, inextricably intertwined. But, the original film actually had a different ending, which directly birthed the next chapter of the saga.
Yeah, the original script for The Karate Kid was supposed to end with a brutal confrontation in the parking lot immediately following the tournament. Johnny's psychotic sensei, John Kreese, furious over the loss and the humiliation of his dojo, attacks Johnny in the parking lot.
Mr. Miyagi steps in to save the boy, effortlessly humiliating Kreese, breaking his knuckles on car windows, and effectively destroying the myth of Cobra Kai right there on the asphalt.
But after they finished filming the euphoric tournament scene, Avildsen looked at the dailies, saw the footage of Daniel being carried off the mat in triumph, and said, I got my movie right there. We don't need to shoot the parking lot scene.
He trusted his cinematic instincts. He knew he had the emotional climax. However, the studio executives, seeing the early screening numbers, were already thinking 10 steps ahead.
They knew they had a massive hit on their hands, and they realized that the unfilmed parking lot confrontation would be the absolute perfect way to violently open a sequel.
The machinery moved incredibly fast. Work on the script for The Karate Kid Part 2 began a mere 10 days after the first film was released in theaters in 1984.
Part 2 takes the narrative in a wildly different direction. It takes Daniel and Miyagi all the way to Okinawa, Japan, because Miyagi receives a letter stating that his estranged father is dying. This fundamentally shifts the focus of the franchise.
It centers Miyagi exploring his past romance with Yuki and a rivalry with Sato. But despite the authentic Okinawan storyline, the production logistics were entirely a Hollywood illusion. They didn't film a single frame in actual Okinawa.
They shot the entire thing in Oahu, Hawaii. They built this massive, sprawling, highly detailed Japanese village set on the Hawaiian island, complete with traditional houses, functioning agricultural fields, and they even rigged the entire set for a massive, practical typhoon sequence at the climax.
And the gamble paid off handsomely. Part 2 was incredibly successful. But then we arrive at 1989's The Karate Kid Part 3.
Oh boy. Part 3. First of all, Ralph Macchio was 27 years old by the time they released it, still trying desperately to play an angsty 18-year-old teenager.
He has openly admitted in interviews that making the movie was a thoroughly miserable experience because the script was hastily written, sloppily rewritten on the fly, and made Daniel regress as a character.
Even John G. Avildsen later called Part 3 a horrible imitation of Part 1.
The great tragedy of Part 3 is that Robert Mark Kamen actually had a radically different, highly ambitious pitch for the third film. He wanted to take the franchise into the realm of historical fantasy. His idea involved Mr. Miyagi and Daniel being transported back to olden-day China in a mystical dream sequence.
Wait, so instead of a cool historical martial arts dream sequence, we got a toxic waste billionaire terrorizing a teenager over a local karate tournament.
It happens because studio executives, especially in the late 1980s, strongly preferred safe, proven formulas over risky creative swings. They flat-out rejected Kamen's ambitious idea and demanded a script that essentially rehashed the first movie. They wanted the original villain, John Kreese, to return.
But right as they agreed on this safe route, they hit a major logistical hurdle. Martin Kove, the actor who played Kreese, had just booked a starring role on a CBS television show called Hard Time on Planet Earth.
Because of his rigid TV shooting schedule, he simply wasn't available to shoot a feature film full-time. And Avildsen, running a tight production, flatly refused to gamble his shooting schedule on trying to film Kove only on his days off.
So, out of pure, frantic logistical necessity, the writers had to scramble and invent a brand new character out of thin air to take over the main villain duties. That is how the character of Terry Silver was born.
introduced as Kreese's old army buddy from Vietnam, who just so happens to be a megalomaniacal industrialist who made a vast fortune by illegally dumping toxic waste across the globe.
And he decides to use his vast corporate fortune to hire a martial arts ringer, Mike Barnes, for the sole purpose of psychologically torturing a teenager from New Jersey. It is so utterly, incomprehensibly over the top.
It is entirely absurd. But if we synthesize this, it is fascinating to see how real-world production logistics completely altered the franchise's lore. They created Terry Silver merely as a stopgap measure. Yet he became absolutely vital to the franchise's mythology decades later because he introduced the concept of corporate franchising into the narrative.
Right, he brought capitalism into the dojo. But at the time, it killed the momentum. After the sequels fizzled out, including the 1994 Hilary Swank soft reboot, the franchise needed a total geographic and stylistic reset.
Which brings us to the 2010 remake. The setting was drastically shifted from the California suburbs to Beijing, China, starring Jackie Chan as Mr. Han and Jaden Smith as Dre Parker.
The martial arts style was changed entirely to wushu, which is kung fu rather than karate.
Wow.
And let me tell you, the choreography is incredibly impressive. The kids bullying Dre in Beijing are genuinely terrifying.
The visual upgrade in the choreography is undeniable, but this raises an important question regarding how intellectual property works. How does a brand name override the actual cultural and factual content of a film?
Right. There's a glaring title contradiction. The movie is called The Karate Kid, but they strictly use kung fu. In fact, within the film itself, there is a scene where Dre explicitly mentions karate, only to be immediately corrected by Mr. Han that they are in China practicing kung fu.
Jackie Chan expected it to be called The Kung Fu Kid, and it actually was in China and other Asian markets. But producer Jerry Weintraub explicitly rejected changing the title for the American release to maintain brand recognition.
It's pure Hollywood marketing machinery at its worst. You slap a famous label on a fundamentally new product to guarantee ticket sales? And to be fair, the 2010 movie definitely has its merits, but it also suffers from modern blockbuster bloat. It runs a sprawling 2.5 hours compared to the original's 2 hours.
There's also that incredibly weird editing mistake where Gray befriends a blonde kid early on, and after the first big fight scene, that kid just vanishes from the movie completely.
Like they forgot to film the rest of his scenes.
Yeah.
But crucially, the true culturally resonant resurrection of the franchise didn't happen until a humble web series called Cobra Kai debuted decades later.
And Cobra Kai picked up the original continuity, flipping the script to show Johnny as a sympathetic anti-hero, proving the depth of the characters established back in 1984. It explores themes of toxic nostalgia and how the alpha male tropes of the 1980s fail men in the modern world.
Why do you think we're still so obsessed with this story? Is it the fights? Or is it the fact that we all secretly want a Mr. Miyagi in our lives? Someone to just look at our messy lives, hand us a sponge, and tell us that if we just breathe in and out, we can actually fix it.
I think it is exactly that. It's the universal search for balance. And as we close out this massive exploration, I'd leave you with a final thought to ponder. Consider how one man's real-life trauma in a 1940s internment camp shaped a 1980s pop culture phenomenon, which in turn spawned a 2010s martial arts remake and a hit streaming series in the 2020s. How many other pieces of lightweight popcorn entertainment are secretly anchored by profound, hidden historical pain?
That is a staggering thought. The next time you see a kid throwing a crane kick on the sidewalk, remember the immense weight of the history and the trauma it took to put that image on screen. And that wraps our deep dive into the Karate Kid movies. If you enjoyed revisiting this iconic underdog story, follow Roll Credits and share it with your fellow movie fans. And don't forget to drop a comment with what movie or show we should cover next, old or new. We'll be back soon with more trivia, more movie magic, and maybe a few more lessons worth learning.